There's a kind of stillness that appears before anything specific takes shape, a faint slowing that doesn't ask for attention, but quietly tests whether attention is available. It doesn't feel like a new thought arriving. It feels more like something that has been waiting just outside the usual range, taking a small step closer once the internal noise drops low enough. The mind doesn't move toward it, yet something in that dim space shifts, as if making room without being asked. Nothing sharp emerges. Nothing forms a narrative. There's only a light impression that some unfinished trace has chosen this moment to drift near the surface again, balanced between distance and nearness in a way that doesn't disturb the quiet, but slightly thickens it. The first sense of it is almost weightless, more like noticing a pause than noticing a thing. The pause has texture, not a physical texture, but an internal grain, the way an idea that isn't fully formed holds a different tone from one that has already been shaped. It sits there, without clear edges, without urgency, as if it has been here many times, before returning with the same muted rhythm whenever the surrounding mental pace becomes slow enough for it to be felt. There's no decision to meet it. It simply enters the field of awareness the way an uninvited but familiar presence would gently, without knocking, as though it always knew this part of the evening belonged to it. What stands out is not the content. There is no content yet, but the contour of its arrival. A soft pressure appears behind the usual line of thoughts, almost like a reminder from an older interior layer that hasn't faded despite being ignored. It doesn't push forward. It simply remains, letting the mind notice the difference between what has been processed and what has only been pushed aside. The contrast is subtle. Processed thoughts tend to dissolve on their own, while this one lingers in place as if anchored by something unfinished in its structure. The awareness of that difference spreads slowly, forming a small shift in internal posture, a kind of quiet lean toward what might be trying to return. The more the mind rests in this softened pace, the clearer the presence becomes, not clearer in meaning, but clearer in tone. It carries the unmistakable sense of having been interrupted once, of having reached a point where it could have continued but didn't. That faint incompletion is what makes it recognizable. Even without form, it holds the outline of something paused mid-motion, a trace whose last step was never taken. The recognition of this is not dramatic. It slips in the way a memory sometimes brushes past without fully revealing itself, leaving only the certainty that it belongs to a moment that didn't finish unfolding. As this awareness settles, the surrounding quiet thickens a little. Not heavy, just denser, as if the unfinished trace adds a small amount of volume to the internal space. The mind doesn't resist it. There's no reason to resist. Nothing threatening is happening. But there's a slight unease that comes not from discomfort, but from familiarity, the sense of meeting something that is visited many times in the same quiet hour, always choosing the moment when everything else loosens its hold. It gives the impression of a recurring appointment the mind never scheduled, yet somehow keeps showing up for, as though unfinished pieces know exactly when the door is unguarded. The moment stretches on without changing much. The trace doesn't sharpen or articulate itself. Instead, it hovers with a steadiness that suggests it is not here to be solved, but simply to be acknowledged. It doesn't demand resolution. it doesn't drift away either. It stays in that soft middle ground, neither close nor far, holding just enough presence to tilt the mental atmosphere slightly. This kind of presence doesn't behave like a thought. It behaves more like a condition, something that influences how thoughts move without becoming one of them. Gradually, the mind begins to sense a boundary, not a firm boundary, but a thin line distinguishing what is part of ordinary thought from what stands apart as unfinished. The unfinished piece sits beyond that line, quiet but persistent, as though waiting to see whether the mind will come toward it or let it remain suspended. There is no intention to cross that line. The quiet of the moment makes it easier simply to watch how it occupies its place, how it returns without ever announcing why. What becomes noticeable next is the shift in breathing rhythm, not as a physical observation, but as an internal pacing cue. The subtle return of the unfinished trace seems to sync itself with a slower internal tempo, as though appearing only when the entire system drifts into a lower register. This gentle coordination between the trace and the inner tempo creates a kind of resonance, the softest suggestion that this moment is not an accident. Yet nothing about it feels orchestrated. It's just the natural consequence of what happens inside when enough stillness collects in one place. Another quiet recognition forms. This unfinished impression is not actually approaching. It has always been here. The only thing changing is the mind's proximity to it. With the surrounding mental activity dimmed, the distance collapses, revealing how easily this trace slips back into awareness when the usual barriers of distraction lower. That realization brings a muted steadiness, as though acknowledging its existence removes a small tension that comes from pretending it disappeared. Nothing more is asked of the moment. Nothing needs to be interpreted. The internal space holds this soft return, the way a slow-moving surface holds a faint ripple clearly there, yet not demanding any response. If anything, the presence of this unfinished piece signals the beginning of a longer, quieter process, the mind preparing to revisit, in its own subdued way, the places it once left halfway, without realizing how many traces they had left behind. There's a peculiarly timed rhythm to the way certain unfinished pieces return, as though they wait for an internal gate to fall open, rather than forcing their way through. They do not appear when the day is moving quickly, or when thoughts are tightly layered. They seem to prefer the hour when everything slows to the lowest register, when the irregular clutter of the day has thinned enough for quieter movements to be felt. And in that softened interval, something begins to shift, not forward, not upward, but toward a gentler availability, like a faint pulse stepping back into range. It never arrives with intention. There is no sense that the mind is calling anything in. It feels more like these fragments monitor the internal pace and respond only when the friction drops. What returns is not a scene, not an emotion, not a memory with texture, but a half-formed contour of something that once paused before it could settle. It carries a familiarity, a tone that unmistakably belongs to the category of things left midway. The recognition of that tone often precedes the recognition of anything else. The mind notices the shift in pacing first. There's a slight elongation between thoughts, a widening in the internal spacing that does not feel empty, but simply less occupied. And it's in these pockets, silent stretched, but not vacant, that the unfinished pieces slip into view. Not clearly, not assertively. More like the way a half-forgotten word begins to hover at the edge of recall without stepping into full articulation. A hovering, a suggestion, an outline made only of tone. What stands out most is the timing. These pieces never try to compete with busy hours. They never rise when attention is pulled outward or when tasks demand quick closure. They don't surface in conversations, decisions, or confrontations. They wait. Not consciously, of course, but rhythmically, matching themselves to the internal lull, the same way certain sounds can only be heard when the room becomes quiet enough. Their return is always tied to a decrease in mental speed. There's something almost mechanical in the pattern. As the mind moves through its late cycle slowing, there is a natural sift, processed content drifts away, easily losing its edge and weight, while unprocessed content remains suspended, as though the mind itself hesitates to release anything that wasn't fully understood. The result is a gentle sorting. What has been resolved fades, and what hasn't finds enough silence to step forward. Not because it insists, but because the quiet finally makes space for it. In that quiet space, the returning fragment doesn't feel intrusive. It doesn't disrupt. It appears with the neutrality of something that has always been part of the background, but finally has the right conditions to be felt again. The moment is subdued, almost anticlimactic. There are no sharp emotions, no sudden clarity, just the recognition that something incomplete has found a way back up through the slowed down layers. And then another pattern emerges. The mind doesn't treat these returning pieces like strangers. It recognizes them immediately, even before it can name them. The familiarity lies not in their details, but in their manner of arrival, the way they settle into place without needing to be invited. It mirrors earlier moments, possibly countless ones, when the mind slowed enough for them to return in the exact same way. This consistency gives them a kind of identity, the things that always show up at the low point of the internal cycle, never earlier. As this awareness deepens, the mind begins to understand that the return of these fragments isn't accidental or random. It's tied to the physics of internal pacing. When the day's movement is loud, these subtle fragments simply don't have the force to rise above the noise. But when the movement recedes, when the residue of urgency dissolves, they rise not out of significance, but out of availability. They are the kind of content that needs quiet to exist. There's a strange comfort in the predictability of their timing. Even though one might not consciously anticipate their arrival, a part of the mind has learned that when things slow enough, unfinished material tends to drift up from its holding place. It doesn't ask for resolution. It doesn't ask for attention. It only asks for room. And the late hours provide just enough room for it to live for a little while at the surface. The mind might try to shift away, to think of something else, but the return is gentle and persistent. Not persistent like a demand, but persistent like a shadow that naturally reappears when the light dims in a certain way. These fragments don't chase attention. They follow the ambient pace. Their reappearance is less a statement and more a symptom of a slowed internal environment. And in this recognition, the mind relaxes its resistance not to embrace these fragments, but to accept that their timing is built into the mechanics of inner life. Once that acceptance forms, the fragments seem to settle more fully, as if being acknowledged gives them enough stability to remain without jostling for space. They remain faint, unshaped, unfinished, but undeniably present. And the mind adjusts to their presence the way one adjusts to a temperature shift, not something to be solved, not something to be questioned, just something to be felt quietly until it fades again. But fading is not the right word. They don't fade, they withdraw. They drift back downward when the internal pace begins to thicken again, when the mental flow returns to a higher gear. And the mind knows, without needing to articulate it, that the next time the pace falls to the same low point, these or other unfinished pieces will return in the same muted way. Their return is not a disruption. It's a rhythm, a quiet agreement between the slower moments of the mind and the fragments that wait for those moments to become reachable again. And as the mind continues to drift in this lowered pace, it starts to understand that these returns are not interruptions, but indicators, soft signals that something from earlier has not fully walked away. There's a moment when the faint outline of something unfinished begins to sharpen, not enough to reveal its full shape, but enough that the mind can sense a clearer distinction between what is merely drifting and what is resurfacing with a kind of purpose. It starts quietly, like a contour, becoming less blurred, not because it is trying to be understood, but because the surrounding noise has lowered enough for it to gather definition. What returns first is not the whole story, not even the emotional landscape attached to it, but the specific fragment where things once halted, a midpoint, a suspended gesture, a line of thought that never found its continuation. This partial clarity is peculiar. It doesn't come with the vividness of memory or the sharpness of reflection. Instead, it comes with a recognition of movement interrupted. The mind begins to see the fragment exactly where it paused, the words that almost formed, but didn't, the reaction that started rising, but never reached expression, the hesitation that quietly closed over the moment before anything could unfold. These half-finished motions appear without their context, yet the absence of context is precisely what makes them recognizable. The mind knows its own incomplete patterns. They carry a distinct internal signature. As this fragment becomes slightly more defined, the mind doesn't rush toward it. There's no attempt to rebuild the scene it belongs to. Instead, there's a curiosity that doesn't ask questions, just a soft acknowledgement that this piece has returned with a clearer edge than before. It feels like touching a thread whose other end is buried, knowing that pulling on it wouldn't bring the whole thing into view, but would only make the knot tighter. So the mind doesn't pull. It simply holds the outline as it is unfinished, unfixed, but undeniably clearer than a moment ago. There's a subtle tension that arises from this clarity, not because the fragment brings discomfort, but because its incompletion is more visible now. When something vague becomes slightly more formed, the mind naturally wants to assign meaning to it, to follow its trajectory. But the prompt master architecture resists that impulse. The mind stays with a raw fragment, no story attached, no analysis applied. Only the sharpened sense of where the fragment had once been cut short, as though someone pressed pause in the middle of a sentence and never returned to finish it. In this stillness, other fragments begin to echo the same pattern, not because they are similar in content, but because the mind recognizes the sensation of an unfinished movement and starts noticing how many of them exist. Each fragment brings its own contour, the last frame of a thought that should have led somewhere, the final note of an emotion that never completed its arc, the small internal recoil that closed a door halfway without fully shutting it. They gather not in a cluster, but in a loose constellation, each one defined only by its incompletion. What becomes interesting is how these fragments, even without form, create a shift in the internal atmosphere. Their clarity is not visual or narrative, it is tonal. A fragment feels unfinished in a different way than a resolved thought feels complete. The former has a slight upward tension, like an inhale, that never became an exhale. The latter dissolves cleanly, leaving no residue. This difference is not emotional, it is structural. And the mind, now attuned to this tonal difference, begins to track it with more precision. The tracking does not lead to answers. It leads to a quieter kind of familiarity. Every time a half-finished piece appears, the mind recognizes the way its presence subtly disrupts the smoothness of thought, not with force, but with unevenness. A small roughness, a slight snag, something that doesn't belong to the current moment, yet insists on grazing the surface of awareness. The more the mind notices this uneven texture, the easier it becomes to identify the presence of something previously left behind. At this stage, the mind stops pretending it doesn't know these fragments. The recognition shifts from, "What is this?" to, "Ah, it's that kind of piece again." Not the specific piece, but the category, the unfinished type, the pause without resolution type. This sort of recognition feels more like orientation than understanding. The mind isn't reconstructing the past. It's simply labeling the internal movement as one it has encountered before. As the clarity of the fragment's edges increases, its weight also becomes more noticeable. Not emotional weight, but cognitive density. The mind senses that this piece occupies just enough space to be felt, but not enough to dominate. It hangs in a peculiar zone, visible but incomplete, present but partial. This is the territory of half-finished things. They neither demand nor disappear. They hover. And in that hovering, the mind begins to sense something else. These fragments do not form a problem. They form a pattern of interruptions, a pattern of moments that didn't get to become themselves, a pattern of small internal exits taken before the moment reached its natural end. Noticing this pattern doesn't create clarity in the narrative sense. It creates clarity in the perceptual sense. The mind knows where to place the sensation now. It is not mystery, it is incompletion. This recognition softens the edges again, not back to vagueness, but to a gentler form of awareness. The fragment doesn't grow brighter or louder. It becomes more comfortable to sit with. The mind leans into it lightly, allowing the unfinished shape to remain unfinished without trying to complete it. And in this acceptance, the fragment's return no longer feels intrusive. It feels like part of the internal architecture, a beam left, exposed, not problematic, just visible. The clarity that emerges here is the clarity of naming the category without naming the story. The mind acknowledges this is one of the pieces that stopped mid-motion, and now it has returned to the point where it stopped. That's all. No more, no less. In this simple acknowledgement, the fragment stabilizes. It no longer flickers. It holds its place with quiet steadiness, waiting for nothing, asking for nothing, simply existing as a half-finished trace resurfaced at the precise moment the mind slowed enough to notice it. There's a slight tightening inside when several half-finished pieces gather at once, a soft tension that doesn't escalate but spreads thinly across the internal field like a subtle thickening of the atmosphere. It isn't a sharp feeling, nothing that demands correction or understanding. It's closer to the sensation of holding something lightweight for so long that its presence finally becomes noticeable. Not heavy, not intrusive, just persistently there. This tension is the natural byproduct of things that never found a place to land, fragments that paused mid-movement and have remained suspended ever since. The mind doesn't experience this tension as a threat. It isn't a cue for action or avoidance. It's more like a quiet awareness that something in the internal system is unfinished in several directions at once. Each fragment holds a slightly different tone, yet they all share the same structural characteristic, a movement that once started but lacked its next step. The tension arises not from their content, but from the way they hover, without settling, occupying a liminal territory where neither progression nor disappearance is available. What's interesting is how they coexist. They don't fuse into a single unresolved mass. They don't compete for attention. Instead, they hang in their own suspended pockets, each one containing the last moment before it was interrupted. A thought that almost completed its arc. A response that almost surfaced. A realization that almost emerged. All of them paused precisely where they lost momentum, frozen mid-gesture, leaving behind a faint pressure that sits just beneath the surface of awareness. This creates a particular kind of internal texture, one where nothing is actively happening, yet nothing is fully still. The fragments generate a barely perceptible vibration, a sense that the mind is touching multiple incomplete notes at the same time, and in touching them, the mind becomes aware of how incompletion itself has weight, not the weight of emotion, but the weight of continuity interrupted. Each fragment is an unfinished line of thought, and together they create a quiet hum of unclosed shapes. As this internal texture becomes clearer, the mind begins to sense how unusual it is compared to moments when thoughts flow freely. There's no smoothness here. The flow is uneven, not because the mind is resisting, but because the fragments themselves are not designed to move forward. They're remnants of halted transitions, tiny thresholds never crossed. And being surrounded by thresholds creates a subtle tension, as though the mind is standing in several doorways without stepping through any of them. What deepens the tension is not the presence of the fragments, but the awareness of their frozen nature. The mind can feel where each one stopped. It can sense the exact point where movement faltered. This recognition isn't emotional, it's structural. It's like observing a line that breaks just before its conclusion. The break is quiet, but the eye cannot help noticing the incompleteness. Similarly, the internal field becomes populated with several broken lines, each one subtly tugging at the boundary of attention. There's also a particular stillness created when the mind recognizes these incomplete lines together rather than one at a time. It's not a cumulative heaviness, but a kind of internal density, the sense that space is slightly more crowded, even though nothing has been added in a concrete way. The fragments don't ask to be addressed, yet their suspended posture makes the mind aware of how much unfinished material has accumulated over time. Not in a judgmental sense, only in a perceptual one. This perceptual shift brings a faint discomfort, though not in the emotional sense. It's the discomfort of being near something that refuses to resolve but refuses to leave. A quiet stalemate. The fragments don't move because they lack the momentum, and the mind doesn't move them because it lacks the clarity. So both sides exist in a shared drift, neither advancing nor withdrawing. The tension lives exactly in that in-between space. Yet instead of amplifying, the tension stabilizes. The mind begins to accept that this middle state is not necessarily a flaw. It is simply the natural consequence of internal processes that were paused long ago. The tension becomes less of a pressure and more of a subtle boundary, a reminder that some parts of the self are still waiting, not urgently, but persistently. They wait without expectation, without timeline. They wait because they never learned how not to. As this understanding settles, the mind notices something softer beneath the tension, a familiarity. These incomplete pieces are not new visitors. They've returned many times. Their suspended shapes are woven into the internal architecture in a way that no longer surprises. The tension they create is not a spike, but a contour, a curvature in the internal landscape that appears whenever the system slows enough to see it. And with that familiarity comes a shift in posture. The mind no longer braces against the tension, no longer perceives it as something that needs to be eliminated or soothed. Instead, it watches the suspended fragments with a kind of observational neutrality, as one might observe dust floating in a shaft of dim light, moving but not progressing, present but not significant enough to capture emotion. They simply are, and their being unfinished is part of their identity. From this place, the tension becomes less sharp, more diffused. It spreads out evenly, rather than clustering, becoming less of a point and more of a texture. A quiet resistance to smoothness. A reminder that not all internal movements complete their arcs, and that the remnants of those interrupted arcs continue to shape the way stillness feels. The incomplete pieces make the stillness feel fuller. Not louder, not heavier, just fuller. A fullness that comes from knowing multiple lines of thought remain forever suspended, each holding the moment where they paused, each contributing to a tension that is not meant to resolve, but to be recognized as part of the night's internal landscape. There's a subtle inevitability to the way the mind drifts back toward the same unfinished points, even when no intention guides it there. You can let your thoughts wander in any direction toward something trivial, toward something routine, toward nothing at all. And yet, when the drift completes its loose circuit, it often returns to the very fragment you had quietly moved away from. It doesn't feel like a choice. It doesn't feel like habit. It feels more like gravity, a faint internal pull that asserts itself only when everything else loses momentum. The mind doesn't rush toward these points. It drifts, meanders, loops around unrelated impressions, touches new ideas lightly, then slowly tilts back toward the same suspended moment, as if the rest of the inner landscape were slightly sloped in that direction. The return is gentle. It doesn't announce itself. You simply notice that your attention, once free-floating, is now resting again on the same incomplete trace, this time from a slightly different angle with a slightly different texture. Each return carries a small change, not in the fragment itself, which remains unfinished, but in the way the mind approaches it. Sometimes the approach is softer, sometimes more cautious, sometimes almost indifferent. The fragment shifts just enough to feel new, while remaining fundamentally the same. It's like encountering a familiar object at dusk. The shape hasn't changed, but the light has, and that slight adjustment alters the entire experience of seeing it. The returns don't follow a rigid cycle. They arise in uneven intervals, sometimes soon, sometimes after a long stretch of unrelated drifting. Yet the pattern is unmistakable, no matter what distance the mind travels. A portion of its movement arcs back to the same suspended point. The repetition isn't forced. It isn't even deliberate. It's simply what happens when something remains incomplete in a way that is not loud enough to dominate, but not faint enough to disappear. What's striking is how neutral these returns feel. They lack the sharpness of obsession or worry. They lack the emotional charge of something painful or unresolved. Instead, they feel like revisiting a page where the last sentence trails off, not out of urgency, but out of an instinctive desire to understand where the thought left off. There's no real effort involved. The mind just naturally glides back there when nothing else holds it firmly. Over time, this quiet reorientation reveals that the fragment acts more like a magnet than a memory. Not because it exerts force, but because the internal field subtly arranges itself around unfinished shapes. The mind gravitates toward what hasn't reached completion, even if only to look at it for a moment before drifting away again. Something about incompleteness draws attention back, not to solve it, but simply because it stands out in a landscape of things that have already settled. There's also a peculiar comfort in the repetition, though not the comforting kind. It's more like a sense of recognition. Ah, I've returned here again. Not in resignation, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement that this is a place the mind passes through when the pace slows. A familiar bend in the road, a recurring checkpoint within a drifting path. You don't aim for it, but you notice when you arrive. The mind begins to understand slowly and without analysis that these returns do not represent fixation or avoidance. They represent an internal rhythm, a way the system checks in on the places where movement once faltered. Each return is like brushing your finger over a thread that protrudes slightly from the fabric, feeling its unevenness without attempting to pull it. The mind knows that pulling would change things too abruptly, so it simply touches the thread again and again, noting that it remains out of place. As this rhythm continues, the fragment becomes less mysterious, not clearer, not more articulate, but less foreign. With each return, the mind recognizes it more quickly, registers its shape without needing to reconstruct it. The familiarity deepens, not because the fragment is being processed, but because the repeated contact reduces its strangeness. It begins to feel like a regular visitor rather than an unexpected one. This familiarity sometimes creates a secondary drift. After lingering with the fragment for a while, the mind drifts away once more, but the new drift is influenced by the encounter. Thoughts move with a slightly altered tone, a different weight, as though the unfinished shape has left a soft indentation in the flow. The mind doesn't cling to the fragment, but it doesn't leave unchanged either. The return and departure form a cycle that subtly reshapes the night's thinking. What becomes even more apparent is the absence of resistance. The mind does not try to prevent the returns. nor does it chase them. There is simply an allowance for the drift to happen. This lack of resistance softens the entire internal environment. Instead of bouncing off the unfinished piece or circling it anxiously, the mind glides to it, stays briefly, then glides away, as naturally as breathing. The fragment starts to feel less like something unresolved and more like something that simply belongs. And there is something revealing in that belonging. The repeated returns show that the fragment is not an intruder, but a part of the internal ecosystem, a part that was never integrated but never expelled. Its incompletion is not a flaw, it is a state. Some thoughts complete themselves, some don't. And the ones that don't acquire a quiet orbit of their own, drawing attention back in a rhythm that feels less like fixation and more like acknowledgement. In this rhythm, the mind gains a different kind of clarity, not about the fragment's origins or meaning, but about its place. It is no longer something to be ignored or forgotten, nor something to be resolved. It is simply a point the mind revisits because it remains open. And as the cycle continues, drift away, drift back, the unfinished piece becomes a subtle anchor, not pulling the mind downward, but reminding it that certain internal lines remain uncompleted and perhaps always will. There's a quiet deepening that happens when the mind begins to notice not just the fragments themselves, but the layers beneath them, the small paused reactions that once rose toward the surface and then receded before they could fully take form. These are not the bigger, more recognizable unfinished moments. They are thinner, softer, almost invisible in ordinary hours. But in this slowed internal pace, they start to appear as faint strata, subtle pauses, withheld responses, emotions that nearly surfaced but dissolved before becoming recognizable. What returns first is not the memory of these reactions, but the sensation of them, a slight tightening that once began but never completed itself, a warmth that almost expanded but folded back in, a flicker of irritation, confusion, longing, anything that rose halfway and then sank because the moment passed too quickly or felt too complicated to follow. These micro reactions begin to cluster, not in a structured way, but in a soft layering that makes the internal space feel denser without feeling crowded. Each layer sits at a different depth. Some are closer to the present surface, still carrying a faint echo of the situation that evoked them. Others sit deeper, nearly erased of context, leaving behind only the residue of a feeling that once tried to form. The mind does not try to categorize them or assign meaning. Instead, it observes the way these layers create a quiet thickness, an accumulation of almost moments that never found a full expression. This thickness is not uncomfortable. It is simply noticeable the way humidity becomes part of the air without drawing attention until you pause long enough to feel it. The layers of unfinished internal responses produce a similar atmosphere, a subtle density that wasn't perceptible before, but now gently shapes the way awareness moves. Thoughts slow slightly as they pass through these layers, like light dimmed by passing through multiple panes of softly tinted glass. The mind begins to understand why these layers feel familiar. They are the places where reactions once began, but didn't become themselves. They were cut short by urgency, social context, distraction, or the instinct to move on, rather than wait for a feeling to find clarity. Each layer represents a tiny self-interruption, a moment where the internal process folded back on itself. The mind now feels them as distinct textures rather than identifiable emotions. As these layers gather into awareness, the mind notices something interesting. Their presence doesn't demand anything. They don't ask to be resolved, revisited, analyzed, or healed. They simply exist as remnants of small interior movements, similar to ripples that never grew into waves. Their return is not a call to action, but a quiet resurfacing of what once almost mattered in a micro way. The mind can feel how many of these micro reactions happened without ever being fully seen. In this observation, there is a soft humility. It becomes clear how many times a reaction was set aside with the assumption that it was too small to matter. But those small interruptions, repeated over years, form a pattern of their own, an internal archive of unfinished micro-expressions. Not dramatic enough to leave scars, not insignificant enough to disappear. Just constant enough to shape a background tone that goes unnoticed until nights like this, when the pace falls low enough for them to drift upward. The emergence of these layers also clarifies how the mind organizes itself. It doesn't file everything into conscious memory. Much of what happens internally remains half-formed and half-forgotten, yet persists as a subtle influence. By noticing these micro-layers, the mind gains access to the architecture of its quieter habits, the ways it holds back, the ways it deflects, the ways it smooths over things too quickly for clarity. And this recognition doesn't feel accusatory. It feels observational, as though the mind is gently acknowledging the patterns without trying to correct them. As the layers settle into awareness, there's a moment where the mind pauses, not because it needs to decide something, but because the presence of so many thinly suspended reactions creates an unusual stillness. A stillness that isn't empty, but filled with the muted residue of things that almost became real. This stillness feels like the pause after a question that was never answered, a space where the mind can finally register the tiny tensions it overlooked. What's striking is how these micro layers interact with one another. They don't merge, they don't collide. They rest quietly, each occupying its own thin band, each contributing a slight shift to the internal atmosphere. Together, they form a kind of depth, a stack of subtle experiences that were never fully acknowledged, but also never fully discarded. The mind senses their cumulative presence like sediment, built over time, not heavy, but undeniably altering the shape of the space. As the mind observes these layers, it begins to realize that they are not random. They carry a similar signature, a beginning without follow-through. Not quite emotional, not quite cognitive, something in between. Each layer marks the point where a reaction was interrupted before it could articulate itself. And in seeing these interruptions collectively, the mind gains a soft understanding of how much internal life happens beneath the threshold of attention. This understanding does not lead to sadness or clarity or insight in the traditional sense. It leads to a quieter kind of awareness, one that recognizes the subtle weight of unfinished micro-reactions without trying to resolve them. The mind simply acknowledges that they are part of the architecture of the present moment, shaping the texture of tonight's awareness. Even as the mind drifts through these layers, it doesn't feel burdened. If anything, there's a sense of continuity, a recognition that these layers were always here, and that their resurfacing is a natural part of slowing down. They're not warning signs or messages. They're simply remnants of the way the mind once moved, now returning in a gentler form. The layering becomes almost soothing in its consistency. Each thin stratum of unfinished reaction supports the next, forming a quiet internal stack that feels less like a problem and more like a record of the many small ways the mind has protected itself by moving on too quickly. And now, in this low-paced moment, the layers reappear, not for correction, but for acknowledgement, offering a subtle reminder of the unspoken, unformed parts of one's interior life. As the mind stays with this soft layering, it feels the internal space expand slightly, not outward, but downward, as though awareness has discovered a deeper floor beneath the usual surface. The layers don't pull the mind anywhere. They simply allow it to understand itself a little better, not through revelation, but through a patient recognition of what has always been waiting beneath. There's a widening that happens once the mind stops looking directly at a single unfinished fragment and instead begins to sense the space around it, an expansion that isn't outward but inward, as though awareness quietly steps back to take in the surrounding terrain. What was once a narrow focus on a specific incomplete moment now grows into a recognition of the entire cluster of unfinished layers that have been gathering beneath the surface. It feels like adjusting a lens. The fragment at the center remains visible, but suddenly the blurred periphery starts coming into view as well. This broadening doesn't arrive as insight. It doesn't sharpen anything. If anything, it softens the edges further. The mind begins to perceive that the fragment it had been circling isn't isolated. It's one among many part of a larger pattern of internal pauses. These pauses are not in conflict with each other. They coexist, lightly touching, forming a quiet constellation of suspended points. Each point represents something briefly interrupted, an incomplete emotional stir, an unspoken sentence, a reaction that didn't finish its arc. As awareness widens, the internal space shifts tone. It no longer feels like a room with a single object under inspection. It feels more like a field with multiple faint markers spread across it. None are demanding attention, and none are trying to hide. They just occupy their places, gently making their presence known through their subtle, persistent incompleteness. This gentle spread introduces a new kind of quiet, not empty quiet, but layered quiet, a quiet that contains multiple currents moving slowly. The mind notices this layered quiet without trying to organize it. Naming the fragments doesn't help. The fragments resist names anyway. They don't hold enough structure to be described. What the mind registers instead is the feeling of many partial shapes residing in the same space. It's a little like hearing several distant sounds at once, not clearly enough to identify them, but enough to sense that your environment contains more dimensions than you were paying attention to. In this broader awareness, something interesting happens. The mind begins to see that the unfinished pieces are not problems. They're patterns. They didn't accumulate because something went wrong. They accumulated because life moves quickly and internal reactions don't always keep up. Some moments demand immediate action. Some interactions close before the internal response has a chance to form. Some emotions begin too softly to be understood in real time. The mind begins to understand these fragments not as mistakes, but as leftovers from the pace of being alive. This understanding shifts the relationship with the fragments. Instead of feeling like intrusions, they feel like artifacts, evidence of how many times the internal world had to pause, skip, or compress itself to keep moving. The mind senses, with a kind of gentle neutrality, how many layers of these artifacts it carries. Not a burden, but a record, a soft archive of slowed reactions. And noticing this archive feels less overwhelming than expected. It feels honest. As this subtle honesty spreads through awareness, the mind experiences a small lowering inside. Not lowering in the sense of sinking, but lowering in the sense of relaxing a grip it didn't know it held. The fragments no longer appear as loose ends demanding closure. They appear as quiet markers of where something once didn't have enough space. And now, in this moment of slowness, they simply occupy the space they were denied earlier. This gentle lowering creates a shift in posture. The mind stops hovering closely over any one fragment. It leans back slightly, observing the field instead of the point. From this vantage, the fragments seem less sharp, less urgent, more integrated into the overall internal landscape. They aren't floating aimlessly. They're suspended in a pattern the mind had been too busy to perceive before. The internal architecture begins to look coherent in its own quiet way. At the same time, the widening brings with it an unfamiliar steadiness. There's a sense that the mind can hold this multiplicity without straining. The fragments aren't crowding. They're simply coexisting. Each incomplete moment retains its place, but the overall field doesn't feel fragmented. It feels continuous, like a tapestry woven from loose threads rather than finished lines. The looseness doesn't diminish the coherence. It creates it. This coherence is not intellectual. It's perceptual. The mind begins to see how these unfinished shapes influence the texture of the present moment. It notices how they thicken quietness, how they bend attention slightly inward, how they create a soft density that shapes the tone of thought. They don't define the moment, but they tint it. And this tint is familiar, so familiar that the mind realizes it has been navigating by it unconsciously for a long time. With this recognition, the awareness widens even further. The mind begins to perceive not just the unfinished layers themselves, but the space between them, a space that is not empty, but softly alive with potential movement. The fragments do not fill the internal field completely. They leave room. Room for attention to drift. Room for awareness to wander between layers. Room for the mind to rest in the intervals, the same way music rests in the spaces between notes. This sense of room gives the moment depth. For the first time in this sequence, the mind feels that it is not merely observing internal remnants, but inhabiting a landscape shaped by them. The landscape feels stable enough to stand within, even though none of its features are solid. Stability comes not from certainty, but from allowance, the willingness to let the field contain what it contains without rearranging it. As the awareness settles into this broader space, there is a quiet shift in the mind's relationship to itself. The fragments cease to feel like isolated interruptions and instead become signs of a deeper continuity, the continuity of how often something almost formed and almost revealed itself. The mind doesn't try to trace that continuity back to its origins. It simply accepts that these patterns exist and that they have shaped its internal gravity. In this acceptance, the widening becomes complete. The internal space now feels open, accommodating, and suffused with a gentle recognition. The layers, the fragments, the suspended reactions they no longer feel like separate objects to be handled. They feel like parts of a single, softly intricate landscape. And the mind, finally seeing that landscape without narrowing or pressing against it, rests in that subtle expansion as if it had been waiting to notice it for a long time. Small details begin to return in a way that feels different from the broader fragments that came before. They don't arrive with weight or significance. They don't carry narratives or emotions. They appear more like faint edges, tiny outlines of moments that once passed quickly, so quickly that the mind never fully registered them. These details feel like thin threads rising through waterlight, wavering almost transparent. Yet their reappearance in this slowed internal pace gives them a kind of understated sharpness enough for awareness to pause and notice them. The first of these details often comes without clear origin. A tone someone used in passing, a shift in your own voice you didn't realize you made, a brief expression that flickered across a face before you could respond. None of these come attached to memory in a full sense. They return as sensations' first micro-impressions. A slight pressure near the moment you almost reacted. A mild pull towards something you didn't follow. A hesitation that once lasted less than a second, but now reappears with a soft, intact form. What stands out is how small they are. Not small as in trivial, but small as in precise, too delicate to survive the pace of daytime thinking, yet able to rise intact when the internal environment becomes quiet enough. Their smallness gives them an unusual clarity. They don't overwhelm. They don't disrupt. They simply hover, allowing the mind to feel the exact contour of where attention slipped past them before. As more of these details surface, the mind begins to notice how many of them exist. A certain inflection in someone's words that you dismissed at the time. A gesture you meant to respond to, but let pass. The sensation of nearly saying something, then choosing silence before the thought finished forming. These moments were too subtle to register fully when they occurred, but they left behind faint imprints, edges without centers, shadows without shapes. And now, with the pace slowed, their edges come forward first. This reappearance carries no emotional spike. There is no regret, no longing, no confusion attached. The details return as what they are, the remnants of micro moments suspended just before becoming meaningful. They hold a particular texture, the texture of near clarity. A detail isn't incomplete in the same way a fragment is. A fragment contains something unfinished. A detail contains something unspoken. Both share incompletion, but the detail embodies it at a smaller, quieter scale. The mind begins to study the differences. A fragment feels like the midpoint of a halted movement. A detail feels like the beginning of a movement so small it never had a chance to unfold. Details return with gentler energy, almost shy. They rest lightly at the periphery, as if unsure whether they belong in the present moment or whether they're merely passing through. The mind attuned now to subtlety notices the uncertainty in their tone. As these details accumulate, the mind starts experiencing them as small openings, places where attention could have lingered but didn't. Each detail reveals a moment when perception moved too quickly, when the internal world didn't have the bandwidth to absorb what was happening in the external one. Not because the moment was overwhelming, but because it was delicate. The mind isn't wired to catch everything, especially the softest parts. But now, in this low arousal state, the softest parts are the ones that rise first. There's something almost intimate about the return of these minute impressions. They don't illuminate anything major. They illuminate the subtle ways you pass through moments without fully being in them. They show the small currents beneath interactions, the things you picked up subconsciously but never consciously recognized. None of this brings clarity in the problem-solving sense. It brings clarity in the perceptual sense, the sense of understanding the texture of one's own attention. The mind begins to realize that these details form a quiet archive of their own, not the archive of unresolved emotions, but the archive of slight misses, small human moments that slipped through the cracks simply because they were too soft for the pace of the day. Their resurfacing suggests that the mind has been keeping them somewhere, even when they seemed insignificant. This realization creates a new kind of awareness, the awareness of how selective attention actually is. Not selective in a deliberate way, but selective by necessity. Every day contains far too many micro-impressions to hold consciously, so the mind lets them pass. Yet they leave behind faint residues, and these residues thin as they accumulate into something recognizable when the night slows everything down. As more details come into view, the mind begins to connect them, not into a story, but into a shared characteristic. Each one represents a point where something subtle brushed against awareness, but didn't stay long enough to enter it fully. The small details hold the tone of interruption, but of a softer kind than the unfinished fragments. They feel like whispers of moments, tiny nudges that once asked for a second look, but were drowned out by whatever came next. There's no regret in seeing them now, only a quiet acknowledgement that they existed and that they still exist as imprints. The mind understands now how these imprints contribute to the internal texture of the present moment. They add softness. They add nuance. They add a kind of gentle complexity that might explain why the night often feels more layered than the day. In this gentle complexity, the mind begins to sense something else. The details don't need to be interpreted. They don't need to be pieced together. Their value lies in their return, not in their meaning. Their return signals that the mind is finally slow enough to perceive the smallest movements of its own history. This perception widens the internal space again. The mind feels itself becoming porous, capable of letting these details emerge without trying to hold them too tightly. It becomes possible to observe the soft returns without being drawn into them. They hover, they shimmer, they recede slightly, then hover again. This quiet oscillation feels natural, almost soothing, though not in a comforting way, more in a rhythmic way. As the moment deepens, the mind stops tracking each detail individually. It begins to sense them collectively, like a faint constellation of small, unfinished impressions. Each one glows lightly for a moment, then dimly, then lightly again. Together, they create a quiet illumination that reveals the intricacy of what the mind collects, even when it believes it has let something go. And with that illumination, a new softness enters the space, not softness as relief, but softness as recognition. The details that didn't seem to matter earlier now shape the way the mind experiences this deeper quiet. They form the delicate scaffolding beneath the more noticeable fragments. They add precision to the night's internal drift. Nothing is resolved by noticing them. Nothing needs to be. Their significance rests in their return, in their delicate persistence, and in the simple truth that even the smallest moments leave traces that wait patiently for slower hours to be seen again. There's a shift inside that isn't quite emotional and isn't quite physical, but sits somewhere between the two, a subtle adjustment in the body's internal rhythm when old, unfinished things begin to rise again. It's not that the body reacts in a dramatic way. Nothing jolts, nothing tightens sharply, nothing demands attention. Instead, it's more like a change in the background tempo, a barely perceptible alteration in how the mind and body move together in this quieter hour. The unfinished fragments carry a kind of internal pacing of their own, and when they surface, the whole system seems to adapt to that pacing. This shift doesn't feel foreign. It feels strangely familiar, as though the body has learned this tempo long before the mind ever consciously noticed it. The internal rhythm, whatever its physical markers might be, mirrors the contour of these unfinished pieces. There is a kind of muted vibration in the moments when they appear, an almost sensation that says, this is one of those things again. Not painful, not intrusive, just distinct. A faint static in the internal air. The mind notices that thoughts begin to move differently when the fragments resurface. Not slower exactly, but more deliberate, as if the internal environment has thickened just enough to influence how attention shifts. The body follows this change not consciously, but as though both systems are operating under the same quiet contract. When old, incomplete traces rise, the pace must adjust to meet them. It's not resistance, it's alignment. There's a moment in this alignment when breathing feels slightly different, not changed, not controlled, but tuned. No physical instructions arise, no deliberate awareness of breath, only the sense that the system has recalibrated itself so the mind can move through the returning fragments without friction. It's like being in a room where the temperature drops just a degree or two, not enough to shiver, only enough to sense that the air has taken on a new quality. And as this happens, the mind begins to recognize the unique rhythm associated with unfinished internal content. It's a rhythm that doesn't exist at any other time. New thoughts move in a clean line. Daily concerns move quickly. Memories move with their own momentum. But unfinished pieces move in a slow, uneven pattern, surfacing, hovering, receding, returning. Their movement shapes the environment around them, and the body seems to respond in kind, as though quieting one part of itself to amplify another. This rhythm has been encountered before, though perhaps not acknowledged. Every time an old fragment resurfaced in the past, the mind likely felt this internal pacing shift without ever naming it. Now, with awareness slowed and attention softened, the shift is unmistakable. The body seems to know something. The mind is only now noticing unfinished things have their own cadence, and that cadence is part of how they return. The more the mind sits with this realization, the clearer the connection becomes. It isn't that the fragments create a physical reaction. Rather, they evoke the same internal pacing that existed in the moment they first paused. The body remembers the tempo of interrupted moments, the same slight heaviness, the same muted pulse, the same inward pull. Not the emotions themselves, those have faded, but the rhythm of the interruption, the way the body once prepared for a continuation that never came. And now, when those fragments drift back into awareness, the body seems to re-enter that rhythm, not out of memory, but out of instinct. It's the kind of instinct that doesn't need conscious recognition to exist. It unfolds on its own in the quiet background, shaping the way the present moment feels. This makes the experience of old things resurfacing feel less like a cognitive event and more like a shift in atmospheric conditions. The mind senses the fragments, and the body subtly participates by adjusting its internal movement. Not in a reactive way, but in a synchronized way, as if both parts of the system are acknowledging, "We felt this before." Once this synchronization is noticed, something else becomes clear. The rhythm is not one of urgency. It's not a call to act or resolve. It's simply a slower, denser pacing that accompanies the resurfacing of unfinished content. A kind of internal dimming, not in the sense of darkness, but in the sense of lowered brightness, an intentional softening of the internal light that allows subtler shapes to be seen. The mind attuned to this dimming begins to study the rhythm more closely. It notices how attention lingers longer on certain thoughts, how gaps between thoughts stretch slightly, how the inner world feels weighted in a way that is not heavy but grounded. The body mirrors this by settling a settling not of stillness, but of readiness to move at a slower pace. This creates an unusual feeling, a soft coherence between mind and body united by the internal pacing of returning fragments. They are not fighting the rhythm. They are matching it. The fragments rise slowly, and the system slows to meet them. The fragments hover, and the system hovers too. The fragments recede, and the system does not chase after them. The pacing becomes mutual. With this coherence comes a realization that the returning fragments are not just mental, they exist in the body's memory of how those unfinished moments felt. Not in detail, not in narrative, but in tone. The tone of a moment that attempted to continue and could not. The tone of a reaction that began but never took its full shape. The tone of an interruption too quiet to notice at the time. And now, in the low interference quiet of the night, those tones rise again, accompanied by the body's subtle recognition of them. This shared recognition deepens the quiet rather than disrupting it. The resurfacing fragments fold into the present moment as though they were always part of its texture. As the awareness lingers on this interplay, the system stabilizes in its new rhythm. The body feels neither tense nor relaxed, neither activated nor slowed. It feels tuned. The mind feels neither burdened nor lightened. It feels aligned. Together, they inhabit the gentle, suspended tempo of returning fragments, an internal pace built specifically for the kind of things that never fully processed and now drift back in muted familiar shapes. And in this aligned state, the resurfacing of old things feels less like intrusion and more like recognition. Recognition of how experience imprints itself in layers, some cognitive, some bodily, all returning when the moment becomes quiet enough to hold them without strain. There's a warmth that appears almost imperceptibly when the mind finally admits that these unfinished pieces never truly left. It isn't a comforting warmth, not the kind that softens or soothes. It's more like the gentle heat that rises when resistance gives way to recognition, a quiet shift in temperature, subtle enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you were already in a slowed internal state like this. The warmth doesn't spread outward. It settles inward, gathering around the realization that these fragments have always lived somewhere in the background, waiting for the mind to slow enough to acknowledge them again. This warmth emerges not because anything has been resolved, but because something has been named, not explicitly, not verbally, but named through the simple act of noticing. Until now, the mind may have treated these pieces as occasional visitors, or worse, as disruptions. But in this moment, there's an unspoken admission. These fragments aren't returning. They're revealing where they've always been kept. They were woven into the quieter layers of inner life resurfacing only when the usual noise dropped low enough for them to be felt. The warmth is slight, but it has a steadying effect. It makes the fragments feel less alien. It softens their edges without erasing their incompleteness. They no longer appear as intrusive reminders of something undone. They appear as parts of the internal landscape, faint contours that have shaped the mind's nighttime thinking for years, maybe longer, even if their influence wasn't previously seen. With this soft recognition, the mind relaxes a grip it didn't realize it held. It stops insisting quietly, unconsciously, on the idea that everything from the past should be fully processed or neatly completed to make sense. Instead, the mind allows for the possibility that incompleteness is not a flaw, but a natural part of its continuity. The warmth expands just enough to make room for that permission. As the warmth settles, the unfinished pieces become less reactive in tone. They don't flare with discomfort or confusion. They sit with a kind of calm familiarity, as though acknowledged presence is enough. The mind recognizes this change immediately, not in an analytical way, but in a perceptual way. The internal temperature has shifted because the internal relationship has shifted. The fragments feel less like burdens and more like artifacts, quiet remnants that carry the muted weight of lived experience. This shift also alters how the mind views itself. It begins to see that its internal world has always contained these suspended shapes, and that its attempts to move past them quickly did not erase them. Those attempts only pushed them into hidden corners where they remained until the quiet allowed them to reappear. The warmth grows slightly here, not indulgent, not sentimental, but honest. Honest about what has lingered. Honest about the fact that these things never vanished, even when the mind believed they had. The warmth also brings with it a small sense of relief, not emotional relief, but structural relief. The mind no longer needs to maintain the illusion that it has forgotten or outgrown certain internal moments. It can simply accept that they remained unfinished. That alone loosens a subtle tension, like a hidden knot inside being freed, not untied, just no longer pulled tight. This is the kind of relief that doesn't change anything externally, but shifts the internal tone from guarded to open. As this tone spreads, the returning fragments begin to feel anchored in a different way. Before they floated hovering on the surface, asking for attention without asking for resolution. Now they feel connected to a longer internal thread part of a lineage of moments that share the same structure of incompletion. This connection gives them a kind of legitimacy. They are no longer stray interruptions in the flow of thought. They are parts of a broader map of how the mind holds experience. What's striking is that this warmth doesn't encourage retrospection. It doesn't invite the mind to revisit, analyze, or correct the original source of the unfinished pieces. Instead, it stays in the present moment, creating a sense that recognizing the fragments is itself enough. The warmth is not directional. It doesn't pull the mind backward. It holds the fragments as they are now present, but not pressing incomplete, but no longer mistaken for something that must be completed. With this holding comes another shift. The fragments lose some of their sharpness, not because they are fading, but because acknowledgement blunts their edges. The mind no longer braces against them. Instead, it allows them to exist without pressure or expectation. The warmth fills the space where resistance used to live. This makes room for something quieter and more stable. The internal atmosphere becomes less centered on the incompleteness and more on the simple fact of their presence. The fragments begin to feel like familiar landmarks in a landscape that is finally being seen clearly. They are not obstacles. They are shapes, irregular, unfinished, but integral. But as the warmth deepens, the mind experiences a subtle reorientation. Instead of trying to make sense of why these fragments remain or what they mean, the mind shifts toward a stance of quiet companionship with them. Not emotional companionship, just coexistence. The warmth supports this coexistence by making the internal space feel slightly more hospitable, less constrained by the need for resolution. This coexistence reveals something important. The unfinished pieces do not need to change to belong. They don't need to be integrated, understood, or completed. They simply need to be acknowledged as part of the inner environment. The warmth affirms that. It holds them gently, letting their incompletion rest without demanding closure. And as this acceptance settles deeper into awareness, the entire internal rhythm shifts again. The fragments no longer rise with tension. They move with a slower, steadier pulse. Their presence no longer alters the mood. They become part of the mood. Quiet, dim, familiar. The warmth wraps around them like a soft frame giving shape without defining content. In this softened frame, the mind realizes something else. Acknowledging that these fragments never left doesn't solve them, but it softens the space in which they live. It lowers the internal stakes. It lets the mind breathe a little more evenly, even if the breath is still quiet and internal. The warmth doesn't transform the fragments. It transforms the distance between the mind and the fragments. And that distance, now gentler and clearer, becomes the foundation for the next layer of awareness, the understanding that these pieces unfinished as they are no longer feel out of place. There's a subtle back and forth that appears once the mind becomes more aware of these unfinished pieces, a quiet oscillation between letting them surface and instinctively pushing them back. It's not dramatic. It's not even deliberate. It unfolds almost like a small internal tide moving in and out without rhythm or prediction. One moment, the fragments feel close, almost aligned with the center of awareness. The next, they drift outward as though the mind gently closes a door without fully meaning to. This oscillation isn't conflict. It's capacity, an internal way of negotiating how much presence feels tolerable at any given moment. At first, it seems like the mind is undecided, unsure whether to lean in toward these fragments or to maintain distance. But as the pattern becomes clearer, it's apparent that this movement isn't indecision, it's regulation. The mind approaches when the moment feels spacious enough to hold the fragments, and it retreats when the nearness feels like too much density in a small space. There's no judgment in this movement, no urgency to hold steady. The oscillation itself becomes a part of the internal experience, as natural as shifting weight while standing still. When the fragments drift closer, the mind opens just a little wider. Awareness becomes more porous, more willing to feel the texture of what resurfaces. The fragments in their muted incompleteness hover in a way that doesn't overwhelm. They simply share the moment. And in that sharing, the mind leans toward them, not to interrogate or resolve, but because their presence feels familiar. A kind of quiet recognition, I know this shape. That recognition brings a faint steadiness, as if being near the fragments feels less like intrusion and more like acknowledgement. But the closeness doesn't last uninterrupted. At some point, sometime soon, sometimes after a long internal drift, the mind senses a slight contraction. Not fear, not avoidance. More like an internal pause that gently reduces the proximity. The fragments drift back, losing a little of their clarity, retreating to an outer ring of awareness. The mind doesn't push them away. It just adjusts its position, almost like a reflex, restoring a comfortable amount of space between itself and what feels too near. This back and forth creates an internal rhythm distinct from the earlier pacing of the night. It's slower, more tidal. When the fragments advance, the mind expands slightly. When they recede, the mind gathers itself back. Neither direction is final. There's no right distance. The entire process feels provisional by nature. As the oscillation continues, the mind begins to recognize the subtle intelligence in it. The returning fragments are not meant to stay close all the time. Their closeness isn't sustainable, and their distance isn't disappearance. The oscillation allows the mind to remain in contact with them without becoming overwhelmed by their unfinished nature. It becomes a way of maintaining connection while still preserving enough space to breathe. There's a faint comfort in this dynamic, though it's not comforting in an emotional sense. It's comforting. In a structural sense, the mind is learning how to hold something incomplete without gripping it. Every approach is gentle, and every retreat is gentle. This gentleness becomes part of the night's cadence. It shows that the mind doesn't need to choose between fully facing the fragments or fully avoiding them. It can move between the two states in a soft rhythm that feels natural. When the fragments drift near again, something different appears, a sense of internal transparency. The mind sees them without filtering, without bracing, without trying to shape them. Their incompleteness feels less like a barrier and more like a contour. The mind doesn't have to fill the gaps. It only has to witness the gaps. And in doing so, it recognizes how much of its inner life consists of precisely these uncompleted impressions. But then, as expected, the proximity eventually becomes too much. Not overwhelming, just too concentrated. A faint density forms, prompting the mind to shift slightly away. The fragments blur. The internal air clears a little. The moment stretches. And the mind feels the relief of regained distance, not because the fragments were threatening, but because closeness requires a kind of internal steadiness that can't be maintained indefinitely. This relief is subtle. It's more like loosening a hand that had been resting too long on a surface. The release isn't about letting go. It's about allowing rest. The fragments, now farther away, continue to exist without demanding anything. They haven't vanished. They haven't dulled. They've simply moved back into a place where awareness can still sense them without being surrounded by them. As the cycle repeats, the oscillation becomes less noticeable. The movement grows smoother, less defined, more fluid. At a certain point, the distinction between near and far starts to dissolve into a continuum. The fragments are neither fully present nor fully absent. They hover along a spectrum of distance, and the mind travels along the same range. With this continuity, a new understanding emerges, not conceptual, but felt. The mind realizes that closeness and distance are not opposites. They are both modes of relating to unfinished material. Each offers something the other lacks. Closeness gives shape. Distance gives space. Together, they create a balanced environment where the fragments can exist without overwhelming and without being exiled. In this environment, the fragments take on a different kind of presence. They no longer feel like things to revisit or things to avoid. They feel like internal weather, moving patterns that rise and recede, shaping the moment without controlling it. Their incompleteness becomes just another part of the internal landscape, shifting with the night's pace. The oscillation becomes the mind's way of staying in quiet conversation with itself. A step forward, a step back. A moment of nearness followed by a moment of space. Nothing forced, nothing denied. The mind and the fragments share the moment in alternating distances, each respecting the other's limits. And as the mind settles deeper into this relational rhythm, it becomes clear that this movement is not instability, it is balance. A subtle living balance that keeps awareness from collapsing into the fragments or abandoning them. A balance that holds both connection and space at once. A balance that says, these unfinished things are here, and you can meet them, but you don't have to hold them continuously. They can drift. You can drift. And the conversation can continue in a quiet, uneven rhythm that fits the shape of the night. There's a point in this quiet sequence where the mind stops focusing on individual fragments and starts noticing the pattern that runs through all of them, not the stories behind them, not the circumstances, but the structure of their return. What first appeared as scattered, unrelated bits of the past now begins to share a recognizable contour. The mind doesn't search for this pattern. It emerges on its own, like a faint outline gradually revealed when the surrounding noise lowers enough for subtle similarities to surface. The first recognition is gentle. Many of the things that resurface carry the same kind of incompletion. They come from different moments, different versions of you, different emotional distances, but the shape of their unfinishedness overlaps. Some stopped right before a response. Some paused just as a feeling began to form. Some stalled in the middle of an internal shift. But the mind can now sense that they all share the same basic architecture. Something started to move and then didn't. This recognition doesn't sharpen the fragments. It softens them. Instead of appearing as separate interruptions, they begin to feel like variations of the same internal phenomenon. The mind understands, without needing to articulate it, that unfinished things often echo each other in tone, even if they don't echo each other in content. The pattern isn't about what happened. It's about how it happened inside you. As awareness settles into this recognition, the mind becomes curious in a different way, not to analyze, but to observe. It begins to track the subtle qualities that repeat across these incomplete shapes. A slight upward tension at the moment where the fragment stops. A flicker of energy that doesn't expand. A muted internal shift that attempted to begin but didn't find space. Once this pattern is seen, more fragments begin to align with it almost eagerly, as though waiting for the mind to finally understand that they are connected by more than timing. The recognition deepens. These fragments aren't returning arbitrarily. They return because they are built on the same kind of interruption, one that the mind performs so quietly and so consistently that it rarely notices the act itself. The pieces resurface not to highlight past events, but to highlight a tendency, a repeated internal motion. A motion of circling something approaching its edge and then retreating. The fragments are the footprints of that motion. This feels significant but not overwhelming. The mind does not leap toward interpretation. It doesn't look for causes or solutions. Instead, it sits with the recognition the same way one sits with a small shift in lighting, aware that something has changed, but not compelled to define what that change means. The clarity is faint, but undeniable. The resurfacing fragments form a quiet map of the places where the mind has historically stepped back from itself. As the pattern continues to assemble itself, the mind begins to understand why the fragments often return at night. It's not about the past. It's about the pattern being more visible when everything slows. The night creates the conditions where the repeated structure of these unfinished motions can be seen. In daylight, each fragment appears isolated. In dimmer hours, they line up like soft constellations, points that don't touch, but that clearly belong to the same formation. This doesn't produce insight in the conventional sense. It produces a shift in posture. The mind stops treating each fragment as a separate task or memory. Instead, it sees them as reflections of an internal habit, a way of stepping away from something before it has finished revealing itself. That habit isn't judged. It's simply acknowledged. And the acknowledgement brings a kind of calm, not soothing, but stabilizing. It's easier to breathe in a space where nothing needs to be individually solved. As the mind observes this internal pattern, it also becomes aware of how the fragments' tones interact with each other. They don't merge, but they resonate faintly, like similar notes played at different times. Each one carries a dim echo of the next. The mind, hearing this echo, realizes that the fragments don't return to remind or demand. They return because the system itself repeats certain motions, and the mind, now listening more carefully, begins to perceive the rhythm beneath those motions. This rhythm isn't smooth. It has small stutters, the places where things once paused. Those stutters form a subtle texture across the internal landscape. And as the mind feels this texture, it understands that the fragments are not isolated bumps, but consistent touch points of how awareness moves through experience. They reveal the shape of attention's hesitations. In recognizing these hesitations, the mind doesn't try to correct them. It simply accepts that they exist. The fragments haven't resurfaced to change anything. They've resurfaced to be seen collectively for the first time. And that collective view has a quiet power. It turns scattered moments into a pattern, and the pattern into a softened truth. The mind has a tendency to stop at the threshold of certain feelings, thoughts, or reactions. With this truth comes a different kind of quiet, deeper and more even. The fragments now feel less like interruptions and more like familiar markers in a landscape the mind has always walked through without noticing the terrain. Their return no longer startles or burdens. It steadies. The recognition grows one layer deeper. This pattern isn't static. It shifts over time, sometimes forming clusters of similar interruptions, sometimes breaking apart into individual pieces. The mind sees that tonight's pattern is only one version of many. The rhythm of hesitation changes depending on the season of life, the surrounding noise, the internal climate. But the underlying structure stays consistent enough to be recognizable. This recognition doesn't bring closure, but it brings orientation. The mind knows now where it is standing within its own history of interrupted moments. And this orientation creates a quiet confidence, not confidence in understanding the past, but in understanding the shape of how the mind responds to itself. As the fragments settle into this patterned clarity, the mind softens around them. They no longer appear as disruptions in the present moment. They appear as quiet truths of how the internal world is built. And for the first time in this sequence, there's no oscillation, no tension, no urgency. There is only a recognition that the things that keep returning do so because they share a common structure, and that structure is part of who you are, not a flaw in who you are. This is the moment where the fragments stop being separate. They become a single, faintly visible map. And the mind seeing that map doesn't feel lost. It feels located. There's a quiet fading that begins once the mind has spent enough time with these returning fragments. Not a disappearance, not a resolution, but a soft dimming of the sharpness they carried when they first resurfaced. What felt earlier like distinct edges, noticeable contours, begins to blur slightly as though repeated contact has smoothed them down. They haven't lost their shape. They've just lost the immediacy that made them stand out. The fragments settle into a gentler register, becoming quieter versions of themselves. This fading doesn't happen suddenly. It unfolds in a slow drift, almost imperceptible at first. The fragments that once felt bright in their incompletion now seem more muted, as though they've stepped a little further into the background of awareness. The mind can still sense them clearly enough to recognize them, but the clarity no longer stings or startles. It rests lightly, like an image that has been viewed so many times that its outlines no longer demand focus. As their sharpness fades, a new kind of relationship forms. The mind no longer approaches them with a sense of novelty. It recognizes them immediately, almost casually. That recognition doesn't diminish their presence. It just changes the weight of it. What once felt like a sudden resurfacing now feels like encountering something familiar, not entirely welcome, not entirely unwelcome, simply known. Their return no longer disrupts the internal flow. It integrates into it. With this familiarity comes a softening of the tension that surrounded them. Earlier, the fragments created a subtle unease because of their incompletion, their suspended motion, their halted nature. Now the mind accepts that incompletion as part of their essence. This acceptance doesn't heal or complete them. It simply removes the quiet pressure to respond, understand, or interpret. The mind begins to let them exist without resisting the way they take up space. This shift creates more room internally, not because the fragments shrink, but because they stop pressing outward. They settle into their own places, neither expanding nor pulling attention toward them. They become background textures, still felt, still present, but no longer dominant. The internal atmosphere lightens not in brightness, but in density. There is more space between thoughts, more space within thoughts, more space around the fragments themselves. The fading sharpness also allows the mind to notice something that wasn't visible before the fragments were never as threatening as they once appeared. Their early intensity came from unfamiliarity, not from inherent heaviness. Now that they are recognized, mapped, and observed repeatedly, they lose the quality of suddenness. They become part of the quiet environment rather than interruptions of it. Their edges dull because the mind is no longer startled by their form. Even as their sharpness fades, the fragments don't dissolve. They never dissolve. Instead, they move deeper into the internal field, where their outlines become softer, but their presence remains intact. The mind can still return to them if it chooses, but it no longer feels pulled or pushed. The relationship becomes optional, something the mind can approach gently without being compelled by discomfort or curiosity. This creates a sensation similar to looking at an old photograph whose emotional charge has faded, but whose familiarity brings a strange comfort. You remember why it mattered once, but the urgency is gone. The image still exists, but it no longer shapes the moment. That's what the fragments feel like now, present known, but no longer sharp enough to steer the night's direction. As the internal quiet expands, the fragments become like faint landmarks, recognizable shapes in a landscape that no longer needs to be navigated. They mark where the mind once paused, where it once hesitated, where it once retreated, but they no longer stand in the way. The sharpness of those points has worn down through repeated noticing, not through solving, through simple contact. This soft erosion of intensity reveals something else too. The human mind adjusts to the things it encounters, often even when those things remain incomplete. Familiarity becomes its own sort of processing. Not completion, not resolution, but integration. The fragments are still unfinished, but they no longer feel like unfinished business. They feel like leftover shapes, neither foundational nor obstructive, just part of the internal texture. In this softened state, the fragments become easier to hold in awareness without flinching. The mind can let them sit closer without discomfort. It can let them drift without guarding against their return. They are still the same incomplete pieces, but their incompletion feels less like a threat and more like a simple fact, one among many facts that make up the interior landscape. The fading also reveals how much of the earlier sharpness was tied to the shock of recognition rather than the fragments themselves. Now that recognition has stabilized, the fragments lose their power to jolt. They return with the same muted tone every time, like a familiar chord quietly struck. The mind doesn't brace for it anymore. It simply hears it. As their presence becomes less pronounced, the surrounding space becomes more noticeable. There's a soft spaciousness around the fragments now, a sense that awareness is no longer crowded by their forms. They occupy less mental bandwidth, not because they have shrunk, but because the mind has grown around them. What once felt too close now feels appropriately placed. Toward the end of this sequence, the fragments feel almost gentle. They hold the same incompletion they always did, but the edge of urgency is gone. The mind can move past them without feeling pulled. it can rest beside them without feeling pressed. Their sharpness has faded into something like a whisper, still present, still distinct, but softer now, softened by time repetition and quiet acknowledgement. And in that softening, the mind discovers a new kind of quiet, the quiet of seeing something unfinished without feeling the impulse to finish it, the quiet of letting incompletion exist without sharpening it into discomfort, the quiet of recognizing that the fragments have become part of the night's dim landscape without overshadowing it. This is where the sharpness fades not into absence, but into a form of acceptance that allows everything to sit more gently inside. There's a particular quiet that forms when the fragments lose their urgency, a quiet that isn't emptiness and isn't relief, but something in between. It's the quiet that comes when the mind realizes it no longer has to brace. Earlier in the night, each returning piece carried a slight tension, an alertness, a readiness for something undefined. Now, with their edges softened and their presence no longer abrupt, that readiness begins to dissolve. The quiet that replaces it is not comforting, but it is steady. It settles like a low, even tone under everything else. This quiet doesn't erase the fragments. They're still here, but their presence no longer pushes outward. Instead, they drift with a kind of neutrality, neither drawing attention nor repelling it. They move in the background with a softness that wasn't available earlier, as though the night has grown wide enough to hold them without strain. This creates a sense of spread and internal spaciousness, where thoughts no longer collide with the old material, but pass beside it naturally. The mind begins to feel this spread in the way attention moves. There are no sharp turns, no sudden pulls. Awareness moves slowly, almost lazily, drifting across the inner landscape without catching on any one shape. The fragments sit at various distances, but none of them demand approach. Their silhouettes feel thinner now, less defined, as though the quiet itself has absorbed some of their density. What remains are outlines recognizable, but softened enough not to disturb the drift. As the internal space widens, something unexpected appears, a faint sense of neutrality toward the unfinished pieces. Not indifference, not detachment, just neutrality, the absence of the earlier reflex to examine or interpret them. The mind no longer circles them, no longer waits for them to clarify themselves. Instead, it lets them exist the way one lets shadows exist in dim light. They're part of the room, and their presence changes the atmosphere, but they don't need to be looked at directly. This neutrality brings a deeper layer of quiet. The earlier layers of quiet were shaped by recognition-tension oscillation. This one is shaped by release, not a deliberate release, but a natural one that occurs when the system stops trying to respond to things it cannot complete. The mind isn't giving up. It's simply ceasing to expect resolution from something that was never designed to resolve. Once the expectation dissolves, the fragments lose their previous gravity. Their presence becomes lighter, almost weightless in the way they occupy space. They no longer feel like remnants of something unfinished. They feel like traces, marks left by past movements that no longer carry the energy of those movements. Awareness passes over them like a breeze through a room, gently without disturbance. In this softened environment, the mind starts noticing the spaces between the fragments more than the fragments themselves. Those spaces are wide open, dimly lit, and calm. They hold the quiet in place. They give the night its tone. They allow the fragments to float without direction or meaning. These spaces feel like pauses, long natural pauses that don't signal anything, don't anticipate anything, don't prepare anything. They simply exist. The presence of these pauses shifts the rhythm of internal life. Earlier, the mind moved between fragments, tracking their appearances and disappearances. Now, it moves through open space, only touching the fragments lightly as it passes. The night becomes a series of gentle expansions periods where nothing needs to be observed closely, nothing needs to be held, nothing needs to be confronted. The fragments drift to the margins, and the margins become where the mind prefers to rest. As this rest deepens, the internal environment begins to feel cohesive in a new way. The fragments once scattered and sharp feel more like elements belonging to the same quiet field. The quiet itself becomes the defining feature, not the incompletion of the fragments. They no longer set the tone. They follow it. They fit into the broader dimness rather than interrupting it. This shift creates stability, not the stability of understanding, but the stability of reduced friction. The mind glides. Thoughts unfold without catching. Awareness feels supported by the quiet, as if the night has formed a soft container around everything unfinished. The container doesn't repair or transform anything. It simply holds it with evenness. The holding becomes its own form of internal stillness. Not a stillness of silence or emptiness, but a stillness where movement slows to the point that even incomplete things stop feeling incomplete. The fragments floating lower in intensity begin to resemble faint impressions rather than unresolved experiences. They fade into the quiet rather than sitting apart from it. The mind starts to feel this quiet not as something passive, but as something active, an internal force shaping the way thoughts move. It pulls everything toward low contrast. It reduces internal noise. It equalizes the fragments and the spaces between them. The night becomes one long exhale, not dramatic, not relieving, but steady. What's noticeable now is how natural the quiet feels. It doesn't feel like an achievement or a transformation. It feels like something that was always underneath the earlier layers of tension and recognition waiting to surface once the fragments lost their sharpness. The mind recognizes this quiet not as new, but as familiar, something it has felt before, in moments when everything else momentarily faded into the background. This familiar quiet carries no expectation. It doesn't push the mind toward insight. It doesn't invite reflection. It simply holds the mind at a comfortable distance from everything it has observed tonight. It says in its own wordless way, "This is enough." Not resolved, not explained, just enough. In this space, the fragments become faint echoes, noticeable but not loud, present but not imposing. They drift with the quiet rather than against it. Their forms blur into the dimness of the hour, and the mind stops distinguishing one from another. They've become part of the larger atmosphere absorbed into the tonal background of the night. The quiet now isn't the absence of activity. It's the presence of gentleness, a gentleness that arises when the mind no longer feels compelled to hold, analyze, or resist anything. It's a quiet shaped by recognition, softened by acceptance, and sustained by the natural dimming of the internal world. The mind rests in that quiet, not because it has reached clarity, but because clarity is no longer required to rest. There's a moment, deep into the night, when everything begins to level out, not because anything has been resolved, but because the internal landscape finally reaches a place where nothing rises above anything else. All the fragments, all the half-formed impressions, all the suspended reactions settle into nearly the same register. None of them sharpen, none of them fade entirely. They hold a steady, muted presence, creating a kind of flat horizon inside the mind. This leveling doesn't feel like numbness. It feels like evenness, the mind no longer leaning forward to examine the fragments, no longer leaning back to avoid them. Awareness finds a middle distance where everything can be seen without pressure. From here, the fragments no longer appear layered or scattered. They arrange themselves into a soft continuity, a single field made up of many small, dim elements that hold their places quietly. In this even field, the fragments lose their hierarchy. There is no first one or important one. No one fragment draws more attention than another. The earlier tendencies to approach, to retreat, to trace patterns fall away. The mind moves in a straight line, now not bending toward or around anything. The night takes on a calm neutrality in which every internal shape is equal in weight, equal in tone, equal in distance. This neutrality is unfamiliar in its steadiness. Earlier in the night, the fragments carried distinct textures, sharpness, tension, oscillation, warmth. Now they carry a single texture, low, soft, unremarkable. The mind feels this shift immediately, though not dramatically. It feels like the internal equivalent of a room where all lights have been dimmed to the same level. Shadows are still present, but none of them stand out. The mind drifts through this uniform space with a kind of steady float. There's no pull anywhere, no resistance, no flare of recognition. Thoughts move in long, even lines because nothing interrupts them. The fragments don't interfere. They accompany. They sit beside the movement rather than inside it. They have become part of the environment, not objects in it. This creates an unusual sensation. The mind feels continuous. Not unified in the sense of clarity, but continuous in the sense of uninterrupted flow. The internal surface is smooth. Awareness glides across it, the way water glides over a flat lake, slow level, without disturbance. The earlier dips and rises caused by unfinished pieces have softened into a gentle sameness. Within this sameness, the fragments feel more stable than ever. Not because they have changed, but because the mind's reaction to them has dissolved. The incompletion they carry is no longer a point of tension. It's simply part of their character. The mind doesn't ask them to be otherwise. It doesn't demand shape or meaning. It allows their unfinished nature to be an ordinary presence. When awareness rests in this kind of evenness, time also adjusts. Moments stretch without feeling long. Thought flows without feeling heavy. Everything moves at the same quiet pace, and the mind senses this uniformity as a kind of internal horizon, a line extending far into the dimness without turning or breaking. There's a soft comfort in this horizon, though not emotional comfort. The comfort comes from the absence of unevenness. Nothing inside rises abruptly or falls away abruptly. The stability feels almost physical, as though the body itself has matched the mind's pacing. Breathing becomes even. Thoughts become even. Sensation becomes even. The fragments match that evenness, settling into the background without friction. As the moments pass in this low, stable register, the mind begins to sense something subtle. The fragments feel closer now, not because they are magnifying, but because distance no longer matters. When everything reaches the same tone, closeness stops feeling like an approach. The fragments simply share the same plane as awareness. They sit beside it, not in front or behind. This proximity doesn't create pressure. It feels neutral. The earlier need to manage distance, sometimes leaning in, sometimes pulling away, disappears because there's no tension left in the proximity. Everything has flattened to the same emotional altitude. Nearness stops feeling like threat or invitation. It feels like coexistence. The mind notices with quiet clarity that this is the first time tonight the fragments have felt neither heavy nor light. They feel balanced, held in suspension, but without strain. Their incompletion remains, but it no longer produces any internal ripple. It becomes a gentle part of the atmosphere, like an unfinished melody that doesn't need resolving to be pleasant. In this balanced space, the internal environment begins to feel almost architectural. The fragments form a soft structure, thin muted beams running across the landscape. Awareness rests on these beams without sinking or rising. They support the quiet shape, the quiet, but do not interfere with it. Their incompletion becomes part of the design rather than a flaw in it. As the mind drifts across this structure, it becomes apparent that the fragments no longer occupy separate positions. They have aligned themselves to the same internal plane. Their edges overlap slightly, creating a sense of continuity rather than fragmentation. They don't blur into one another. They harmonize. Their shared tone creates an internal field the mind can inhabit without effort. This inhabiting feels natural. It feels like something the mind has been moving toward all night without realizing it. The oscillation, the recognition, the softening each stage brought the fragments closer to this quiet alignment. Now, in this moment, they rest in a stable formation, and the mind rests with them. What's most striking here is the absence of narrative. The fragments do not form a story. They do not even form a sequence. They form a field, a wide, low, steady field, where nothing demands to be understood. The quiet becomes the meaningful part, not the fragments themselves. As the night settles deeper into this uniform tone, the mind understands something implicitly. This is what it feels like when unfinished things stop trying to become finished. This is what it feels like when the internal world accepts its own uneven history without trying to smooth it out or sharpen it. The level quiet holds everything gently. The fragments float in it like thin shapes on still water, neither sinking nor rising, simply being carried by the calm. And the mind, fully aligned with that calm, drifts with them, not toward meaning, not toward resolution, but toward a deeper, quieter form of presence, where nothing needs to change to feel settled. There's a point in the night where the quiet becomes so steady that the fragments no longer feel like separate shapes at all. They begin to blend into the atmosphere itself. Not merge, not dissolve, but drift into a kind of shared stillness where each one loses its individual contour. The mind doesn't watch them anymore. It doesn't track which one arrives, which one fades, which one hovers. Everything settles into a diffuse presence, a soft hum of unfinishedness that fills the internal space without forming any distinct edges. This is the stage where clarity stops mattering. The fragments have been seen, recognized, softened, and leveled. What remains now is something subtler, a sense of ambient incompletion that shapes the room of the mind without needing to define itself. It feels like walking into a dim space where light doesn't fall on any particular object, yet the entire room has a tone you can sense but not name. The fragments have become that tone. The mind drifts through this ambiance slowly. Thoughts move, but not toward anything. They move like someone walking through fog, not trying to reach a destination, not trying to understand the fog, just participating in its density. The internal world feels coated with a faint layer of unfinished impressions that no longer feel like they belong to the past or even to memory. They feel present, suspended in a way that doesn't require origin or explanation. This quality of atmosphere creates a different kind of quiet one that eliminates the need for distinction. There is no longer this fragment or that feeling or that unfinished reaction. Instead, there's a continuous field of small signals, all equally dim, all equally gentle, all equally unresolvable. The mind enters that field without resistance, guided by a rhythm that is barely a rhythm at all. Within this field, attention stops behaving the way it usually does. It doesn't focus. It doesn't roam. It doesn't tighten or loosen. It just rests, diffuse, and open, as though the night itself has become the shape of awareness. This resting doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like alignment, the mind matching the evenness of the fragments until both move at the same low register. As this alignment deepens, the sense of time changes too. Moments no longer feel sequential. They blur. They stretch. Each second seems to fold into the next without transition, creating the impression of a single ongoing moment rather than a series of them. The fragments contribute to this effect. Their steady, unchanging presence gives the mind no reason to mark time through shifts or triggers. Everything feels suspended. In this suspension, the fragments lose their identity as pieces of something. They become conditions, not emotional conditions, not cognitive ones, just environmental. The same way humidity becomes part of the air, or faint noise becomes part of silence. The fragments now serve as a low, constant background texture that is neither comforting nor unsettling. It simply exists. The mind notices this shift gradually. At first, it feels like nothing is happening. Then it realizes that nothing needs to happen. The fragments aren't here to spur recognition anymore. They've completed their earlier phases, resurfacing, sharpening, softening, fading, leveling. What remains now is their presence, and presence has no task attached to it. The unfinished things are no longer trying to speak. They are simply staying. This staying has a stabilizing effect. The internal world feels held, but lightly held by something that doesn't grip. The fragments do not anchor the mind, but they prevent it from drifting too far upward or outward. They act like a gentle weight on a piece of paper, keeping it in place without restricting its surface. The mind moves, but it moves within a contained softness that feels neither confining nor freeing. It feels neutral. There is a strange beauty in this neutrality. It removes the need for direction. It removes the need for meaning. It removes the need for introspection. The mind isn't trying to understand anything anymore. It is simply participating in the texture of its own atmosphere. That participation feels pure, not in a moral sense, but in a structural one. Thought exists without task, and awareness exists without tension. As the night deepens further, the fragments become almost indistinguishable from the quiet itself. If earlier they resembled small objects floating in dim light, now they resemble the light itself, diffuse, ungraspable, impossible to separate from the space they fill. The internal landscape feels unbroken. There are no peaks, no dips, no suddenly brightened spots. Everything is evenly dim. And in this even dimness, the mind becomes aware of its own drifting, not drifting away, not drifting toward, but drifting with. The fragments have created a current subtle but consistent, and the mind matches it effortlessly. It doesn't decide to follow the current. It simply follows because there's nowhere else to go. Movement becomes automatic, gentle, almost imperceptible. This leads to a kind of internal dissolve, not of memory, not of identity, but of boundaries. The mind stops distinguishing between itself and the fragments between thought and atmosphere. It becomes a point suspended in the same dim current that holds everything else. There's no merging, no blending, no loss of self, just a shared stillness where differentiation loses relevance. Awareness feels thinner here, softer, less defined. It doesn't flicker. It glows faintly. It doesn't tighten. It hovers. It doesn't interpret. It receives. The fragments which once seemed like visitors now seem like quiet inhabitants of the same space. Their incompletion no longer feels like something separate. It feels like a natural part of how the mind exists in this hour, unfinished, unhurried, and untroubled by that state. As the sequence settles into this deep drift, the mind recognizes a final truth about the fragments. Their return was not about asking to be processed. It was about revealing the tone beneath all the internal movement, the tone that emerges only when everything slows enough to let the unfinished sit in place without demanding resolution. The fragments drift. The mind drifts. And the drift becomes the landscape itself, toneless, weightless, endlessly dim. There's a stage near the end of the night where the fragments no longer feel like fragments at all. They feel like a quiet, continuous presence that moves alongside you, not distinct enough to examine, not distant enough to ignore. It's as if every unfinished piece has settled into a low, steady register, forming a soft companionship that doesn't ask for participation. The mind doesn't look at them anymore. It simply senses that something is drifting nearby, matching its pace without needing acknowledgement. This companionship isn't emotional. It doesn't resemble comfort or connection. It feels more like being in a room with someone who isn't speaking, someone whose presence is so consistent and gentle that you stop remembering when they arrived. The fragments become that presence, not individuals, not memories, just a shared field of low, steady awareness that moves with you through the quiet. As this presence settles in the mind, stops trying to place it. Earlier in the night, there was a need to understand what was resurfacing, to track the contours of each unfinished shape. Now that impulse softens. The mind accepts that what's around it doesn't need to be parsed. It doesn't need to be named. It only needs to be felt in the gentle background way one feels the dimness of a room rather than the objects inside it. The fragments have become part of that dimness. This shift creates a subtle warmth in the internal atmosphere. Again, not emotional warmth, but the kind that comes from recognizing that something has been here long enough to feel familiar. The fragments no longer resemble intruders. They resemble long-time inhabitants of a quiet corner of the mind, returning to walk beside you without pressing forward. Their edges have faded so much that they blend into a soft continuity, forming a muted companionship that doesn't pull attention but doesn't leave it either. In this companionship, the mind moves gently. Thoughts drift without urgency, without direction. Awareness glides across the internal space as though carried by the same slow current that moves the fragments. Nothing sharp remains. Nothing demands approach. The presence beside you feels almost ambient, as though it were part of the room rather than a thing within it. As the night deepens, the companionship takes on a faint clarity, not clarity of meaning, but clarity of tone. The sense of something unfinished no longer feels like tension. It feels like recognition, a recognition that your internal world has always held these quiet traces, and that their return doesn't signify disturbance, but continuity. You recognize the tone of them the same way you'd recognize a familiar silence. This recognition is not cognitive, it's experiential. The presence beside you feels like something you've known across many nights, even if you never noticed it fully until now. It's the presence of things that linger, things that accompany things that hover just out of focus but never leave entirely. Their companionship is built from their persistence, not from their clarity. As you move through the quiet with this presence beside you, the mind begins to sense a deeper stillness forming. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness that comes when nothing inside is pulling in any direction. The fragments, having shed their earlier urgency, contribute to this stillness by simply staying. They don't move forward. They don't drift away. They hold their place with a mute steadiness that allows you to rest in the rhythm of the moment. This stillness spreads through the internal field slowly. It lowers the contrast between thoughts, reduces the friction between impressions, smooths the unevenness of earlier hours. Everything settles into the same low hum. The fragments hum with it. Awareness hums with it. The quiet becomes a shared condition rather than a backdrop. In this shared condition, you begin to sense a certain closeness that isn't about proximity. It's about alignment. The fragments are no longer things you observe. They've become part of the way you experience the night. Their companionship is subtle, shaped by the soft echo of unfinishedness that resonates through the entire internal space. You don't look at them. You look with them, though the looking is diffuse and gentle. Something shifts in this closeness. You no longer try to determine where the fragments end and where the quiet begins. You no longer separate your own drifting from theirs. The companionship becomes an ambient condition, one where boundaries matter less than tone. The unfinished pieces share your quiet. You share theirs. The night becomes a place where both exist without pressure. As this mutual presence continues, the fragments begin to feel almost reassuring, not in the sense of comfort, but in the sense of stability. Their persistence provides a low anchor. Their neutrality provides balance. Their lack of demand provides space. They don't brighten the night or darken it. They simply accompany it, adding a subtle density that keeps the mind from floating too far up or sinking too far down. The companionship deepens in a way that barely registers. There is no shift you can point to, no moment that announces itself. Instead, the presence grows thicker by degrees, like dim light becoming slightly dimmer, or silence becoming slightly heavier. You don't notice the change as it happens. You notice only that the internal world feels more settled than before. And then there's a realization, not sharp, not verbal, but felt that the fragments have stopped being unfinished things and have become part of the quiet itself. Their companionship doesn't feel like something added to the night. It feels like something that defines the night. They give the quiet its texture. They give the quiet its depth. They give the quiet its tone. In this realization, the mind doesn't move toward insight. It moves toward stillness, not a stillness created by clarity, but one created by presence, the presence of something that has been here all along, softly drifting gently, returning now, resting beside you in a quiet that feels slower than time. This is the companionship of unfinished things, not loud, not bright, not heavy, not demanding, just quietly, persistently. They're matching the pace of your drifting, sharing the dimness of the hour, without requiring anything from it. There's a kind of settling that happens only at the very end, when the night is deep enough, the rhythm slow enough, and the internal world quiet enough that everything unfinished no longer feels like something separate from you. It doesn't merge. It doesn't resolve. It doesn't dissolve into clarity. Instead, it reaches a state where it simply continues, not forward, not backward, but alongside you in a quiet that no longer needs definition. This continuation isn't a choice. It isn't even an experience. It's more like a condition, something the mind steps into naturally, once all earlier movements, recognition, softening, fading companionship have run their course. The fragments don't assert themselves anymore. They don't hover or return or shift. They hold a steady neutral presence, as if they found the exact distance where they can exist without altering the quiet and without being altered by it. The mind drifts in that same register. It doesn't analyze or recall or accompany. It simply moves at the same pace as the fragments carried by a rhythm so low it barely feels like movement. The thoughts that arise now carry the same tone, dim, unhurried, free of edges. Nothing stands out. Nothing dips. Everything shares a uniform softness, as though the night has pressed its thumb lightly across the entire inner surface, smoothing out the last remaining ridges. In this evenness, awareness begins to feel almost transparent. You sense things, but without grasping. You notice, but without following. The fragments that earlier shaped your internal focus now blur into the atmosphere, becoming indistinguishable from the quiet itself. They're still there, faint shapes, muted impressions, but they no longer hold identity. They're part of the internal weather, diffuse, settled, and ongoing. The continuity of this moment carries a different texture from the earlier stages. When the fragments first resurfaced, they carried definition. When they softened, they carried warmth. When they found companionship, they carried tone. Now at the end, they carry nothing. They exist without content. They persist without message. They continue without trajectory. Their unfinishedness remains, but in a form so gentle it no longer feels like incompletion. It feels like a natural part of the night's dim landscape. The internal environment matches this quality. Thought flows with the same neutrality. Breathing aligns with the same low pace. Awareness floats without attachment, without interpretation. There is no sense of before or after anymore. Everything that has happened tonight feels folded into the same moment, one long, quiet stretch where nothing rises enough to create separation. This lack of separation creates a sense of spaciousness that isn't wide but deep. The mind no longer roams across the internal field. It rests within it. The fragments help shape this rest, not by anchoring the mind, but by providing a faint grounding tone that keeps awareness close to itself. Their presence becomes a soft perimeter, a border that doesn't restrict, but gently contains the quiet, so it doesn't scatter. Within this contained quiet time feels less like a sequence and more like a pool still dark without edges. The mind floats inside it, easily held by the same suspension that holds the fragments. No thought tries to complete itself. No feeling attempts to rise. The night becomes a steady hum of things that simply exist without needing to become anything else. This is the moment where the mind stops expecting movement. It accepts that some things don't complete their arcs and that their continuation doesn't require resolution. The fragment's unfinishedness becomes a mirror of the night's own stillness, something that persists because it has no reason to change. The mind matches that persistence with its own quiet presence. And as both settle into that alignment, the internal distinction between thought and fragment quiet and presence unfinished and complete stops holding meaning. Everything shares the same dim, gentle continuity. Nothing separates enough to interrupt it. You don't feel closure here. Closure belongs to things that end. Nothing is ending in this moment. You don't feel revelation either. Revelation belongs to things that sharpen. Nothing sharpens now. What you feel is more like an internal resting that doesn't relieve or restore, but simply holds. The fragments remain. The quiet remains. You remain. All in the same slow register, all suspended in a way that feels neither temporary nor permanent. There's no impulse to look ahead, no impulse to return to anything from earlier. The night has reached its own equilibrium, and the mind has matched it. Even the awareness that things are unfinished feels unnecessary. Unfinishedness has become so natural that it no longer opposes anything. It just exists as part of the internal fabric. In this fabric, everything feels even. Everything feels dim. Everything feels quietly ongoing. This is the final movement of the night's drifting, not arrival, not understanding, not release, just continuation. A continuation so soft it barely feels like motion, yet so steady it becomes the only motion that makes sense. And the mind, resting inside that continuity, lets the quiet stretch forward without asking where it leads. Because continuation in this hour is enough.